What if the most powerful pain relief system ever assembled wasn't invented in a laboratory in the last 50 years, but was already documented plant by plant in texts written thousands of years before aspirin existed? We spend billions of dollars every year on pain management, prescription drugs, over-the-counter pills, patches, injections. And yet chronic pain affects more people today than at almost any point in recorded history. Somehow, with all of our technology, we've gotten worse at something that ancient healers handled with plants they grew in their gardens. That's not an accident, and it's not a mystery either, once you understand what they actually knew. Today, we're going through 10 plants that old healers trusted specifically for pain, sleep, and physical strength. Not because they were the only options available, because they worked, because generation after generation came back to them, and because modern research is now confirming, in double-blind trials and randomized controlled studies, exactly why. Stay with me, because number 4 on this list was so medically significant in the ancient world that it appears in the oldest surgical texts ever discovered, and the compound responsible for its effects was only isolated by chemists in the 20th century. And number 1, the plant that opens this entire conversation, has been shown in multiple peer-reviewed studies to outperform a common class of over-the-counter pain medication for one specific type of inflammation. It's probably in your kitchen right now. If you want to understand what your ancestors knew about the body that most people today have completely forgotten, subscribe now. We add new videos on forgotten healing knowledge every week. Item 10. Passion flower. Most people who've heard of passion flower know it vaguely as a sleep supplement, something in an herbal tea blend, something mild and slightly forgettable. But here's what most people miss. Passion flower, Passiflora incarnata, was the primary sedative used across the entire North American indigenous healing tradition for several hundred years before European contact. The Cherokee, the Algonquin, the Aztec healers, working separately on opposite ends of a continent, all arrived independently at the same plant for the same set of problems: anxiety, sleeplessness, pain that wouldn't release, a mind that wouldn't quiet. When Spanish missionaries encountered it in the 1500s, they were so struck by the structure of the flower, the corona they read as the crown of thorns, the 5 petals as the wounds, that they named it after the Passion of Christ. Which tells you something. This was a plant significant enough that people paid close attention to it. The naming wasn't casual. The plant demanded a name. What actually makes it work is a set of flavonoids, primarily chrysin, that bind to GABA receptors in the brain, the same receptor system that benzodiazepines target. The difference is that passion flower doesn't produce the dependency profile, the cognitive suppression, or the tolerance cascade that comes with pharmaceutical anxiolytics. Multiple randomized controlled trials have confirmed its effectiveness for generalized anxiety and sleep latency reduction. One study published in Phytotherapy Research found that passion flower extract performed comparably to oxazepam for anxiety treatment without the side effects profile. The reason it disappeared from clinical use is exactly what you'd expect. You can't patent a flower. By the time pharmaceutical companies were extracting and isolating the active compounds in the mid-20th century, the patent window had closed before it opened. There was no business model in telling people to grow passiflora in their backyard. The most effective preparation is a tincture, or strong tea, of the dried aerial parts, leaves, stems, the whole above-ground plant, steeping for 15 to 20 minutes in just boiled water, 1 cup in the hour before sleep. The Cherokee already knew this. They just didn't need a randomized controlled trial to confirm it. Item 9. Boswellia. Why was frankincense worth as much as gold? That question gets asked occasionally, usually in December, and then forgotten. But it's worth actually answering. Because the answer is not spiritual, it's pharmacological. Frankincense, the resin of Boswellia sacra and related species, was traded across thousands of miles of desert and ocean for more than 5,000 years. Egyptian physicians used it for wound healing, for arthritis, for respiratory inflammation. It appears in the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents in existence, dated to roughly 1550 BCE, as a treatment for joint disease and inflammatory conditions. The ancient Ayurvedic tradition in India called it shalaki and used it specifically for the same set of problems: chronic joint pain, inflammatory bowel conditions, swelling that wouldn't resolve. Matthew 2:11. The Magi bring gold, frankincense, and myrrh to Bethlehem. We read this as a gift story, but in the medical context of the ancient world, this was a pharmacy. These weren't decorative items. They were the three most medicinally significant substances a healer could carry. The active compounds responsible are called boswellic acids, specifically AKBA, acetyl-11-keto-beta-boswellic acid, and they work by inhibiting 5-lipoxygenase, an enzyme that drives the leukotriene inflammatory pathway. This is a fundamentally different mechanism than NSAIDs, which target COX enzymes. What that means practically, boswellia reaches inflammatory pathways that aspirin and ibuprofen don't touch, particularly the inflammation underlying osteoarthritis, IBD, and asthma. Multiple clinical trials, including peer-reviewed work published in Phytomedicine in the Indian Journal of Pharmacology, have confirmed significant reduction in knee pain and improved joint function with standardized boswellia extract. The reason frankincense became a perfume ingredient rather than a medicine is the same reason essential oils are considered luxury wellness items rather than clinical tools. The fragrance industry was worth more, marketed better, and had no interest in the medical application. The highest quality resin is harvested by hand-tapping the bark of mature boswellia trees in Somalia, Ethiopia, and Oman, the same regions it came from 5,000 years ago. The yield per tree per year is small, which is part of why it was always expensive, and part of why it was always worth it. Item 8. Ashwagandha. There is a word in Sanskrit, rasayana, that doesn't translate cleanly into English. It means something close to the path of essence. In Ayurvedic medicine, a rasayana was a substance that didn't just treat a symptom, it fundamentally rebuilt the body's capacity for strength, resilience, and endurance. A root that changed the baseline. Ashwagandha, Withania somnifera, has been classified as a rasayana for at least 3,000 years. Its name means smell of horse in Sanskrit, a reference both to the root's earthy aroma and to the belief that consuming it would give you the strength and vitality of a stallion. Ayurvedic physicians prescribed it specifically for men and women who were physically depleted, after illness, during periods of extreme stress, when recovery from injury stalled. Most people today know ashwagandha as a stress supplement. And yes, the withanolides in the root are potent adaptogens that reduce cortisol, the primary stress hormone, by measurable amounts in clinical conditions. Randomized controlled trials have found cortisol reduction of up to 28% with standardized root extract over 60 days. That number matters because elevated cortisol is not just uncomfortable. It directly suppresses immune function, degrades muscle tissue, disrupts sleep architecture, and accelerates inflammatory damage. But here's what most people miss about ashwagandha. The strength application was not metaphorical. A 2015 double-blind, placebo-controlled study in the Journal of the International Society of Sports Nutrition found that men taking ashwagandha root extract had significantly greater gains in muscle strength and recovery compared to placebo, measurable increases in bench press and leg extension strength, and a greater reduction in exercise-induced muscle damage markers, including creatine kinase. 3,000 years ago, they called it the path of essence. Today, we'd call it adaptogenic modulation of cortisol, testosterone, and inflammatory recovery biomarkers. The mechanism is new. The plant is not. Item 7. Valerian. The Romans conquered most of the known world. Their armies walked 20 miles a day, carrying 40-pound packs through mountains, deserts, and northern cold that men from the Mediterranean had never experienced. What did their field physicians carry for pain and sleeplessness after battle? Valerian, Valeriana officinalis, called pew by the Greeks, a name that gives some indication of what the root smells like. Galen prescribed it. Hippocrates documented it. It was used continuously through the medieval period, when European apothecaries kept it as a primary treatment for what they called nervous disorders, what we would now recognize as anxiety, insomnia, and the kind of physical pain that goes unresolved because the nervous system never fully shifts out of alarm. Valerian root contains valerianic acid, which inhibits GABA transaminase, the enzyme that breaks down GABA, effectively raising the brain's own calming neurotransmitter without introducing an external sedative compound. It also contains isovaleric acid and a range of iridoid valipatriates that have demonstrated muscle relaxant properties in multiple clinical settings. The result is not sedation in the pharmaceutical sense. It is a progressive quieting of the nervous system, pain that eases, a body that lets go. Meta-analyses across more than a dozen clinical trials have confirmed subjective sleep quality improvement, with particular effectiveness for sleep onset and early morning waking. One specific finding worth noting: valerian appears most effective taken consistently for 2 to 4 weeks, rather than as a single-night intervention. Ancient healers understood this as a restorative arc, not a quick fix. Valerian fell out of mainstream use primarily in the early 20th century, when barbiturates and later benzodiazepines offered faster, more predictable sedation, drugs you could measure and patent. The fact that these drugs also carry significant dependency risk, withdrawal complications, and cognitive impairment was not considered a reason to revisit valerian. It still isn't in most clinical settings. Root tea or standardized extract, taken in the evening. The smell is genuinely unpleasant. The sleep is genuinely better. Item 6. Holy Basil, Exodus 30:23. God instructs Moses to prepare a sacred anointing oil using a precise list of ingredients: myrrh, cinnamon, calamus, cassia, and olive oil. The measurements are exact. The purpose is sacred, and it is set apart. This oil was not for ordinary use. The plant traditions surrounding what became known as holy basil, Oxymum tenuiflorum, called tulsi in India, carry the same quality of reverence across multiple completely separate civilizations. In Hindu tradition, tulsi is grown in temple courtyards and household altars throughout India and Southeast Asia. For more than 3,000 years, it has been used medicinally as a treatment for fever, respiratory inflammation, joint pain, and stress. Not one of these, all of them. This breadth of application is not superstition. It reflects the plant's actual pharmacological profile. Holy basil contains eugenol, rosmarinic acid, ursolic acid, and a complex of volatile oils that collectively demonstrate anti-inflammatory, adaptogenic, antibacterial, and analgesic activity. Ursolic acid specifically has been found in cell studies to inhibit multiple inflammatory pathways simultaneously, including COX2, NF-kappa B, and STAT3, which explains why healers in traditions with no knowledge of each other arrived at the same plant for such a wide range of inflammatory conditions. Peer-reviewed clinical trials have confirmed reduction in fasting blood glucose, cortisol levels, and markers of systemic inflammation in human subjects taking tulsi extract. A study in the Journal of Ayurveda and Integrative Medicine found significant improvement in cognitive function and stress biomarkers over a 60-day period. The sacred designation is not irrational when you understand the plant's range. When something reliably reduces fever, eases joint pain, calms the mind, and improves immune response, across a 3,000-year clinical record in a civilization with highly developed medical knowledge, calling it sacred is the accurate response. What else would you call it? Item 5. Lavender. The word lavender comes from the Latin lavare, to wash, and the Romans did wash with it. They added it to baths, to wound dressings, to the oil they used on soldiers' bodies after combat. Medieval herbalists across Europe, working entirely independently of each other, converged on lavender for anxiety, headache, nerve pain, and disturbed sleep. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess who was one of the most rigorous medical minds of her era, documented lavender preparations in specific detail with specific applications and specific contraindications. Modern medicine dismissed all of this as pleasant-smelling folklore for about 200 years. Then the research started. The primary active compound in lavender is linalool, a terpene alcohol that has now been shown in multiple clinical studies to reduce anxiety, lower heart rate, and modulate the same GABAA receptor system that both valerian and passionflower affect. A standardized oral lavender preparation called siloxane has been through multiple European Phase 3 clinical trials and is approved in Germany as a pharmaceutical treatment for generalized anxiety, the first plant-derived anxiety treatment to go through that specific regulatory process in modern Europe. But here's what most people miss. In 2016, a study published in the Journal of Alternative and Complementary Medicine compared lavender aromatherapy to standard pain protocol for needle insertion anxiety and pain in pediatric patients. The lavender group had statistically significantly lower pain scores. This is not aromatherapy as mood enhancement. This is aromatherapy as analgesic intervention. Lavender's medical identity was buried under the fragrance industry. A plant that had been a healer for 2,000 years became a candle ingredient, a soap scent, something you associate with department store cosmetics, not with the neuroscience of pain modulation. It was always a medicine. That part just stopped being interesting once it became a perfume. Item 4. White willow bark. The Ebers Papyrus, 1550 BCE, ancient Egypt, contains specific prescriptions using willow bark for pain and fever. Egyptian physicians were not guessing. They were documenting a treatment they had been using for generations, probably for centuries before the papyrus was written. Hippocrates prescribed it. The Chinese pharmacopoeia Shenong Ben Cao Jing, compiled around 100 CE, lists willow bark for musculoskeletal pain. Indigenous peoples of the Americas, with no contact with Egypt, Greece, or China, had independently identified willow bark as a treatment for headache, joint pain, and fever. Every major medical tradition on Earth converged on the same bark. The compound responsible is salicin, a glycoside that the human body converts to salicylic acid. In 1853, a French chemist acetylated salicylic acid and produced acetyl salicylic acid. Bayer trademarked it in 1899 as aspirin. The pharmaceutical industry had taken a compound that healers had been using for 3,500 years, modified it slightly, and patented the modification. Here is the distinction that matters. White willow bark contains salicin, plus a complex of flavonoids, polyphenols, and tannins that modulate how the body processes the pain-relieving compounds. The result, according to comparative clinical studies, is a slower onset and longer duration of action than pharmaceutical aspirin, with significantly less gastric irritation. A Cochrane review of clinical trials for low back pain found that willow bark extract produced dose-dependent pain relief comparable to rofecoxib, a COX-2 inhibitor, in patients with chronic lower back pain. The Egyptians did not have mass spectrometers. They had tens of thousands of people over hundreds of years, providing direct feedback on what reduced pain and what did not. The compound they found is the same compound that became the world's best-selling drug. They just found it first, in a form the body apparently handles better. Willow bark tea, or a standardized extract standardized to 15% salicin content. Not a curiosity. A 3,500-year clinical record with a peer-reviewed Cochrane review attached. Item 3. Elderberry Hippocrates called it his medicine chest. That phrase is usually quoted as a nice piece of ancient color. It is worth taking seriously. The elder tree, Sambucus nigra, was used in ancient Greece, in ancient Egypt, in the Celtic healing traditions of Northern Europe, and throughout the indigenous healing traditions of North America, for the same things, everywhere: immune function, respiratory illness, fever management, inflammation. The berries, the flowers, the bark, the leaves, every part of the plant had a documented application. In rural European communities, well into the early 20th century, it was standard practice to plant elder at the entrance of the family home, specifically because of its protective health associations. The relevant compounds are a family of anthocyanins, called cyanidin-3-glucoside and cyanidin-3-sambubioside, along with flavonoids including quercetin and rutin. What these compounds do, according to multiple double-blind, placebo-controlled trials, is measurably reduce the duration and severity of influenza. A meta-analysis published in Complementary Medicine Research pooled data from randomized controlled trials and found that elderberry supplementation significantly reduced upper respiratory symptoms, with average duration of cold and flu illness reduced by 2 to 4 days in the treated groups. The mechanism involves direct inhibition of viral surface proteins. Elderberry compounds appear to physically prevent the virus from attaching to and entering host cells, as well as upregulation of cytokine production that enhances immune surveillance. Elderberry is currently in clinical trials as part of combination investigations for viral respiratory infections, which means researchers are now investigating, with modern technology, what Hippocrates was already prescribing in 400 BCE, his medicine chest. He meant it literally. Item 2. Turmeric, the Sushruta Samhita, one of the foundational texts of Ayurvedic surgery, dated conservatively to around 600 BCE, lists turmeric as a treatment for sprains, bruises, post-surgical inflammation, and wound healing. The Atharva Veda, even older, references it in purification and healing contexts. In traditional Chinese medicine, Jiang Huang, turmeric, has been prescribed for over 2,000 years, specifically for what TCM calls blood stagnation, what we would call chronic inflammatory conditions affecting tissue and joint. When Arab traders carried turmeric into medieval Europe through the spice routes, European physicians called it Indian saffron and began prescribing it for liver conditions, inflammatory pain, and digestive disorders. Every medical tradition that encountered this plant integrated it into healing practice, not as a flavor, as a medicine. The compound is curcumin, and its story is unusual in the research literature. Curcumin has been the subject of more than 12,000 published studies: anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, neuroprotective, potential anti-tumor activity. The research scope is extraordinarily broad. Multiple randomized controlled trials have found that curcumin supplementation reduces CRP, a primary marker of systemic inflammation, and reduces arthritic joint pain with efficacy comparable to ibuprofen in head-to-head studies, without the gastric lining damage that ibuprofen reliably produces with long-term use. Here's what most people miss. Raw turmeric contains only about 3% curcumin by weight, and curcumin has notoriously poor bioavailability on its own. The ancient Indian solution to this problem was to combine turmeric with black pepper and fat, which is exactly how traditional Indian cooking uses it. Piperine and black pepper enhances curcumin bioavailability by up to 2,000%. This was not an accident of flavor. This was a delivery system refined over centuries of observation. Curcumin cannot be patented. No pharmaceutical company has financial incentive to run the large phase 3 trials required for drug approval on a compound the entire world can grow in a garden. The research exists. The clinical trials are substantial. The regulatory approval for a pain indication does not and will not exist, for precisely that reason. Add a half teaspoon of turmeric to warm food or milk. Add a pinch of black pepper. Add a small amount of fat. Wait for what the Ayurvedic physicians figured out 2,600 years ago. Item 1. Ginger soldiers crossed deserts with it. Sailors carried it across oceans. Roman physicians prescribed it. The Quran references it. In Revelation 18:13, the fall of Babylon is mourned through a list of the great trading commodities of the ancient world, and ginger is on that list, alongside gold, silver, precious stones, and fine linen. The fall of a city was significant enough to lament. Ginger was significant enough to include in the lament. For most of recorded human history, ginger was not a cooking ingredient that also had medicinal uses. It was a medicine that people also cooked with. Zingiber officinale has been documented in Chinese medical texts since at least 400 BCE. Confucius reportedly ate it with every meal. The Ayurvedic tradition calls it Vishwabhisaj, the universal medicine. Arab physicians in the medieval period prescribed it for joint disease, digestive inflammation, nausea, and fever. The consistent thread across all of these traditions, separated by centuries and thousands of miles. This plant reliably reduces pain and inflammation in the body. The active compounds responsible are gingerols and shogaols, phenolic compounds formed from the raw root and the dried/cooked root, respectively, and they are structurally sophisticated pharmacological agents. Gingerols inhibit both COX-1 and COX-2 enzymes, the same enzymes that ibuprofen and aspirin target. But ginger also inhibits 5-lipoxygenase, the leukotriene inflammatory pathway that NSAIDs do not reach. This dual pathway inhibition is not replicated by any single over-the-counter anti-inflammatory pharmaceutical currently available without a prescription. Multiple randomized controlled trials have now confirmed what ancient healers documented. A double-blind study in osteoarthritis and cartilage found that ginger extract significantly reduced pain and disability in osteoarthritis of the knee compared to placebo. A study in phytotherapy research found ginger as effective as meclofenamic acid, a prescription NSAID, for primary dysmenorrhea, period pain in a head-to-head trial. In a study of long-distance runners, ginger consumption reduced exercise-induced muscle pain and inflammatory markers more effectively than placebo, a finding that would not have surprised a single Roman soldier, medieval Arab physician, or Confucian scholar who had been using this root for the same purpose for 2,000 years. It grows in every climate. It costs almost nothing. It requires no prescription, and it hits inflammatory pathways that your ibuprofen bottle cannot reach. The fall of Babylon was mourned. Ginger was mentioned by name. That is not a coincidence. That is 2,000 years of Mediterranean civilization, acknowledging in the most dramatic possible terms exactly how important this plant was. It is probably in your kitchen right now. The real question is whether you're using it the way your ancestors did, or treating it like a garnish. There is a pattern running through every plant in this list. None of them were discovered and then abandoned as better options appeared. They were used continuously by intelligent people in sophisticated medical traditions across thousands of years, and then systematically displaced, not because something better was found, but because something patentable was invented. The ancient healers who relied on these plants were not primitive. They were rigorous. They had something modern. Pharmaceutical trials are only beginning to replicate. Generations of continuous, uninterrupted feedback from millions of real patients in real conditions about what actually worked. Not a 12-week trial, 12 centuries. Modern science did not discover what ginger does to the inflammatory cascade. It confirmed it. Modern science did not find out that boswellia reaches leukotriene pathways that NSAIDs miss. It explained why healers across 5,000 years of medical tradition already knew to use it. The difference between discovering and confirming is larger than it looks. One note on quality. There is a significant difference between a standardized botanical extract calibrated to active compound content and a discount supplement filled with filler and trace amounts of the actual plant. If you're going to use any of these, find sources that list the extraction ratio or active compound standardization. That information was not relevant 2,000 years ago because people used the whole plant. Today it matters. Pick one plant from this list, one that corresponds to something you're actually dealing with right now, and use it properly for 30 days. Not as a curiosity, as a practice. That's what the old healers would have done. They weren't experimenting. They were trusting a system that had already been tested longer than any clinical trial in history. What surprised you most in this list? Leave it in the comments, and let me know if you're already using any of these or which one you're going to start with. Next week, the 10 foods that ancient physicians prescribed that most people today have completely removed from their diets, and the research explaining exactly what that removal has cost us.